Are you a writer looking to get published? Do you wonder after you finish a piece of work where you're going to send it? And then when you do send it, do you ask yourself, who's getting this? What does that publisher look like? What does that publisher think like, act like? What is that publisher looking for? Well, have I got a surprise for you? My name is Vin Dacquino, and today we have a publisher right here, right now. Our guest today is none other than Judith Kernan. Judith, let's talk writing.
Okay.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here because
Thank
you are a double threat. Not only are you a publisher, but you're a writer yourself. And your work focuses mostly on poetry?
Yeah.
Good. So let's talk about who is Judy? When did you get into writing? When do you first remember ever writing a poem yourself?
Well, I don't know is the answer to that.
That's a fair answer.
I was a bookish kid.
Yeah.
The earliest thing I have any record of was when I was in 5th grade. It was in the
Okay.
PTA magazine.
Wow, published in 5th grade?
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Yeah. And I recently found an old notebook of work that I did when I was in college. I know that I did a little book, I may have a copy of it somewhere, when I was in 7th grade,
Wow.
which was mostly animal poems.
Of course.
And I got a lot of support for writing from my teachers and from my parents. And so it was simply something that I always did and always knew I would do.
Okay, so let's see the progress. So 7th grade, you're still writing. High school, you're writing a little
yeah.
bit more.
And I had a great English teacher who,
Oh,
I know at least 3 other writers who came out of the same class that I was in.
What did that English teacher say or do that helped you begin your passion for writing?
Well, I think primarily she encouraged us. She had high standards. It was not a matter that
good.
everything you wrote was good. And I actually got a C from her once.
Yeah.
I could not write a sonnet to save my life.
Yeah.
But, or I did write a sonnet, but it was a satire, and she didn't appreciate the satire. But she valued writing. I remember her walking up and down the aisles, essentially declaiming Tom Wolfe's, this is Thomas Wolfe, not Tom Wolfe.
Oh,
Oh,
Thomas
lost,
Wolfe.
oh, tempest tossed. You know, a very romantic sort
Yeah,
of figure.
yes.
And people in her English classes wrote and were encouraged to write and were encouraged to be creative and imaginative. And then when I got to my senior year, I was taught that no professor of college would ever accept a sentence that ran a whole page, which I could pull off grammatically correctly, I want you to know.
Wow.
My Faulknerian sentences.
Wow, yeah,
But
really.
I
Faulkner
learned to
would be
trim it
proud of
back.
you.
I learned discipline from the senior professor.
Let's talk about discipline.
Yeah.
Discipline for a writer means what?
Well, I like to say that you have 2 sides to your brain, and there's some biological
Yeah, I may have a
theories
couple
about
other
that.
sides in there.
One of them, dreams. It's visual. It tells you things you didn't know, or it reflects back to you things you didn't know you knew, is actually more accurate, I think. And the other side is your critic. And your critic remembers everything it's ever read, is able to tell when you're writing grammatically correctly or not,
Yeah.
is able to recognize a cliche and say, The problem is, a lot of people, and I've seen many students who do this, sit down in front of a blank screen or a blank piece of paper, and immediately the critic is there. And the critic says, you have nothing to say. You have nothing new to say. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say. And what I teach is you have to tell the critic, I don't need you right now. Take a coffee break. Go out and have a cigarette.
Great.
Come back when I'm ready. It is not never darken my door again. I'm going to need you, but not now.
Now, there you go.
When you're drafting, you do not want the critic around. You want it to be free flow.
I tell my writers, don't start wallpapering your walls until you build a house.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
And it depends on what you're writing.
Yeah, all right.
I mean, I think for nonfiction prose, certainly, you have to know where you're going. For fiction, I'm less sure of that, because what I know of fiction from my own experience, which is somewhat limited, and what other people have told me is, you need to know who your character is and what's at stake for that character. And something had better be at stake. But then the story has to tell itself to you. And if you don't surprise yourself, you're not going to surprise your reader.
Let the character tell the story. Breathe life into your character
That's right.
and let that character go
And
on
in
his
a
or her
sort
own.
of similar way, in poetry, you may think you know what you want to write about, but you have to find out from writing it. And it may not be what you think it is. The hardest poem to write is the one where you think you know what you want to say, because what you're going to say is what everybody already knows.
That's it.
So finding out what the poem has to say to you, surprising yourself,
Bring
discovering
something
things,
new to the idea.
no, I would say more allowing something to emerge. It's an unconscious or a subconscious process. And it often, in my experience and frankly in my aesthetic, it comes from the imagery. It comes from making the reader feel or see or smell or touch something.
That makes me want to hear a Judy Kerman.
Well, okay. I like to read this because
Wonderful.
it's a formal poem. Now,
Oh,
most
good.
people think formal poems have to rhyme. This does not rhyme.
Okay.
It is in a form called an alphabetic acrostic,
I know
which
it well.
means every line starts with the letter of the alphabet and the next line is the next letter. This runs from A to Z, not skipping any.
Wow.
And you as a journalist will appreciate that this has something to do with a printer.
Okay.
Or maybe a printer, he is. It is called sub-rub, which is and is not a typo. Okay? Along the street, boxes on posts wait for a car to cruise slowly past and deposit the daily paper. Every morning as the mist floats up and vanishes into sunlight, gravel crunches in the drive and Howard comes home. Ink stains his fingers. Journeyman printer, his night shifts killing his dreams. He goes in, washes up, lies down next to his sleeping wife. Meltwater drips from the eaves. New crocus buds pop out by the fence. He hears it all, pines for sleep in a dark room, thinks about quitting his job. Next door, Rita, in her bathrobe, sips her coffee, then touches up her lipstick. She wishes he'd notice. Her imagination x-rays the dark wall of his house, yearning, thinking of zippers, ink-rimmed fingernails.
That is wonderful.
Thank you. Now, it is a narrative, which I don't always do narrative poems. It is a formal poem in its
It's
type.
very difficult to do it as an acrostic, too.
You know,
because
it's not as difficult as you might think. I use it as an exercise with first semester creative writing students. That's my theory about form. It keeps your critic busy with something.
That's
like, I need a B.
Yeah, right.
Critic, find me a B. And then the subconscious can go.
I love the idea of talking to your head. I did that with my students as well, where I say, look, you are you. Your mind is one part of that. When your mind says, go wash the car while you're writing, you have to say, not now.
Not now. Yeah, that's a procrastination trick.
Yeah, and procrastination is a major stumbling block for many writers.
I haven't licked it yet.
I mean, it's so easy. And it's incredibly creative how you can come up with some wonderful
isn't it?
procrastination. And when you can convince yourself, oh, listen, I have
Now,
to be
there's
doing
a book,
this.
right?
You're right, there's a
99
book.
ways to avoid writing.
That's right. 99 ways to avoid procrastination. Wow, that's.
No, I mean to
I'll do it, but I
procrastinate.
don't have time.
Right.
All right, now here's another question for you. Now you're a writer of book. How many books have you actually written?
8 books of my own poetry.
Wonderful.
Counting chapbooks, which are these little skinny things.
Right.
I think technically this is a chapbook,
Yeah.
although it's not bound the way they sometimes are. I also have 2 books of translations
Wow.
from Spanish, from Caribbean women,
Wow.
Dominican and Cuban, and those are up there.
All right, so you're writing these books, and you're out of high school now. You're in college.
Yeah, but I wasn't writing books.
You weren't
yet.
writing books in college. It was after college that you started really writing books. When did the real passion kick in?
Oh, the real passion was always there.
was
but
always there.
I don't think poets think in terms of writing books first. They think about writing poems
Poems,
first.
yeah.
And then after a while, you've got a dozen or 100 or 200, and you
Yeah.
say, I want to put a book together, or I ought to put a book together.
Yeah, which is difficult. I tell, a lot of writers, I say, listen, when's the last time you bought a book of poems? And they say, yeah. It's a hard sell.
It's a hard sell.
It's very
And
difficult.
I have taken my books to writers' conferences, and I'm very struck that the people who teach the workshops buy books, but the people who come to take the workshops don't.
No, you're right.
And particularly with poetry, but hopefully not so much with other things.
Yeah.
But we need to be clear about something. People think that because there are some writers, J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, people like that, who have gotten fabulously wealthy writing books, that there's a career here.
I know.
And there is not, especially for
It's
poetry.
difficult.
People make their livings teaching or selling life insurance, which is what Wallace Stevens did.
Yeah.
Very, very few. Nobody.
Yeah.
I don't think there are poets that make their living as
Yeah, and especially
poets.
poetry.
Or if they do, they're out on the road all the time giving
I've
readings.
sent poems, and the payment is a copy of the magazine.
Sure.
How many copies of the magazine are going to put
Sure.
bread on your table?
Or two copies, and then you have to figure out who to give one of them to.
Yeah, right. Poetry is a hard sell, and it's difficult. And yet, people think, oh, man, it's 10 lines. Duh, anybody can do it.
Yeah, 10 lines that went through 25 revisions.
Right. Anybody can write a poem, but not everyone can write the poem. The poem that does exactly what it needs to do in the way it needs to do it. And it doesn't matter if it rhymes, if it's short, if it's long, if it's funny, if it's sad. The question is, does the poem do what it was set out to do?
And the question is not, what did you mean it to do? The question is, what did you discover that it meant to do?
That's right.
And sometimes,
journey.
as in the case of Subrub, the form leads you there. I didn't know what that poem was going to be.
Yeah.
I had no idea what that poem was going to be.
Yeah.
I needed a C.
And
Or I
I
needed
love
a
that.
D.
People look at me like I'm crazy when I say to them, when I'm writing a novel, the thing I love most about it is to find out what's going to
Sure.
happen. I'm the first one to read it.
Sure, absolutely.
And I'm amazed. And sometimes I actually make myself cry. I look and I go, oh, no, I can't believe he did that. Oh, man, that was
Sure.
great. Or that was sad.
But you have to
or,
get
oh,
out
that
of
is
the
so
way and
Yeah.
not tell the book what to become.
Let the character tell his or her story.
Right.
You're right. So, here's a question for you. When was the transition? When did Judy say, you know what, I'm going to help other people get published?
I think it was, I was the editor of the literary magazine in high school and again in college.
Oh.
So probably it started there. I'm
Yep.
conscious of it being about a year after I graduated from college when I was going to open mics. And I remember somebody reading a poem and my thinking, someone ought to publish that.
Wow.
And I carried it around with me for a while. And for a long time I thought, the world doesn't need any more literary magazines. And then came the women's movement. And a lot of women had noticed, and I think mostly women had noticed, that if you picked up an anthology or a literary magazine, maybe 10% of the writers were women. So
Sybil
I said to
Ludington.
myself, either the magazines and the anthologists are not open to women's work, or the women don't feel welcome and they're not sending it.
Yeah.
And having a very bad habit myself of not sending stuff out, I said, it doesn't matter which it is. And I started a magazine called Earth's Daughters, which I started in 1971, and it is still operating. There's a group of women in Buffalo who are running it. I am told I established a major cultural institution in Buffalo. It's about 12 people who are the collective that run it.
Wow.
And for a while, I was affiliated, after I left Buffalo, I started actually doing the book press, because we got some manuscripts that were chapbook sized. And we decided, since I was leaving Buffalo at that point for my first job outside of SUNY, that I would take the book jobs along with me And those were the first Mayapple Press books, but they were also issued as numbers of the magazine.
Now, were you teaching before Mayapple Press?
No, I was actually a college administrator. I taught as a graduate student, but I became an administrator, maybe 3 years into graduate school, part-time. And there were no jobs for English faculty, as there still are, mostly not.
Right.
And I was very glad that I liked academic work and I loved administration, and I was an administrator for 25 years.
Wow.
So I moved around. I was at University of Michigan for a while. I was at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. I was at Kent State. Then I moved to Saginaw, Michigan, Saginaw Valley State University, and I was a dean there for 6 years. And then I went to the faculty. So the first time I was a full-time faculty member was after a 25-year administrative career. That's the opposite of the usual way.
Yeah, that is.
But
really
I started
is.
doing the press when I was at University of Michigan. And then for almost 10 years, it was essentially inactive because I couldn't figure out how to market books.
Yeah.
And one day when I was in Saginaw, 92 or 91, I got a manuscript that I couldn't turn down because I still had the press listed in directories. And every so often, once or twice a year, I'd get a manuscript just because people were going through directories and that's how they find publishers. And I couldn't turn it down. I called the woman up and I said, "What do you have in mind?" And she said, "I'm giving readings, I need books."
Wow.
So I did hers, and then she twisted my arm into doing another one. And for quite a long time, I was doing 1 or 2 books a year. And when I started getting ready to retire, my university has a phased retirement system where you can go to reduced load. And I upped the number 5, 7, 8. The most we've ever done is 14.
Wow.
10 to 12 is kind of typical. Generally, I'll do a book a month, but sometimes 2, and not in December.
How long has Mayapple Press been around now?
Well, technically, I started in 78, but in terms of being active, since 92.
Wow.
We're old, as such
you're
things
old.
go.
Yes, you are.
And we are not a 501c3. We are what is called a mission-driven press, meaning we're not expecting to make any money. I don't draw a salary,
I know.
but we don't get grants. And I think I just hit the mic, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, they have fits back there. Wow.
So we have about 110 titles. That's about 90% poetry by one author.
So this isn't a career, it's a mission. Yeah.
That's well said. It's a mission.
I hear you.
I have been told I'm an enabler, and that's in the positive sense.
I feel that's what I am
Yeah.
here. That's why I do
Yeah.
this. To let people know when you have something to say it.
Yep.
And there's so many drawer
But you may
poets.
not
I
know
meet 'em
what
all the
you have
time.
to say until you start saying it.
Until you actually get the experience
Yep.
of sitting down and letting that piece take you over.
Yep.
And when that happens, it's like catching that trout.
Yep.
Once you do that, you'll be at that
I
bank
think
100 times.
the hardest place to do that is creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
I mean, nonfiction, journalistic nonfiction, that's
Right.
fairly straightforward. You've got some information you want to impart.
Right.
But memoir, like I taught creative nonfiction 1 year, and it was the first time anyone at my university taught it, and the question was, why would anyone want to read this?
Yeah.
Now, we get a lot of inquiries from people who have been sexually abused or they've had some other traumatic experience.
Right.
And there is an audience for that. It's other people who've had that illness.
Right.
But to find one of those that is actually generally interesting to a broader audience, first of all, it has to be wonderfully well written, and they're usually not. And it has to have some other dimension. We have a piece here, The Russian Writer's Daughter. That is a memoir about growing up on the west side of Manhattan and being a teenager during the McCarthy era, Jewish socialist Russian parents.
Wow.
And it's a very sophisticated and subtle book. The stories are wonderful. The sense of who this author was when she was a child or a young teenager is vivid. Her relationship with her father in particular, her parents in general, and her brother is vivid and lively. But there's also an awareness of what dangers the world held
Yep.
for Russian Jewish socialists under the McCarthy era and with Stalin operating in Russia, which you get from the book, even though at the time the author didn't believe her parents when they were worried about things. She thought they were being melodramatic.
Yeah.
And so you get this whole complex sense of the family life, of the society around it. Well, it's in some ways not an accident. She's a sociologist. But she's also a writer, or that wouldn't happen.
All right, so I have a haunting question. What turns Judy on or off to a manuscript?
Well, as I said, about 90% of our work is poetry.
Okay.
And the world is full of people who write poetry who think that
Their work is the best.
their work is the best and everyone is just dying to see their poems. Wrong. Wrong.
Right.
So, first of all, it has to do something new. It has to give me an experience that I haven't had before. There has to be a richness of language and skill with language. The first thing that turns off an editor, and I don't care if this is poetry or prose, is typographical errors that have not been caught, spelling errors that have not been caught.
So rule number one for any
Know
writer,
how
don't
to write. Or
send
get yourself a
anything in
damn
with
good
this-
editor.
Yep, before you send it to the
Before
publisher.
you send it to the
Before
publisher.
you send it to the publisher.
Absolutely. I have no patience. My first reader has no patience. I have a couple of people who read for me.
Oh, yeah.
And now there is an occasional exception. Somebody who wrote wonderful stories, and we wrote her back and said, "You have to send this to an editor because we don't want to read it anymore. But these are good stories." She sent it to an editor. She sent it back to me, and it still had mistakes in it.
Oh, my goodness.
So my associate editor is now working with her on a paid basis
Oh,
to
there you
clean
go.
the thing up because we want the book because the stories are great, but it's
What
very
makes-
rare.
So something has to jump off the page.
Something
It
has to jump off the
touch
page.
your
It has to
emotions in
put me
some
into
way.
a world. More than touching my emotions, it has to put me into a world with my whole imagination. My body imagination has to be engaged.
It's interesting when I talk to the writers, and I talk to them about every writer has 5 tools: plot, character, setting, theme, and tone.
Yep.
And the question is, which one should you focus on? And the answer is, it depends on where the story is coming from.
Sure.
Some people say, hey, you create a setting that I can feel
But then
I'm
something
in.
has to happen.
Right. They say, create a setting that I feel I'm in. Others say, no. Create a character that I could either love or hate and that I could identify with. Others say, no, theme. You have to have something that people care about. The others say, no, plot. Something has to happen.
Yeah.
You have to have some kind of conflict, some kind of
But
drama.
you see, all of those are encompassed in the
Exactly.
idea that there has to be a character about whom the reader can care, whether the character is a good person or not. If it's a perfectly good person, we don't care. If it's a perfectly bad person, we don't care.
Yeah.
But
Just
if it's
get
a
us
person
involved.
who has the kinds of flaws that human beings have and the kinds of virtues that human beings have, and they're in a dilemma, there's
Someone
something
we-
at stake, and we don't know how it's going to come out.
And to combine all of those things and
That's
to
right.
let your character find them.
Right.
Let your character find his place, his drama,
Now that's fiction, and maybe memoir.
and maybe even poetry.
Well,
But
sometimes.
poetry you could focus on one at a time. You
But
don't have to
poetry
do all
doesn't
of them.
have to have characters.
No, right. It could be setting, it could
Doesn't
be
have
theme.
to
it
necessarily
could
have plot.
But it could have any one of those.
Sure. Now I want to say
Yep.
that between the hopeless, at the other extreme, there
Right.
is work that is very fashionable right now.
Okay. What is
That-
it? What's hot?
I'm not going to mention any names,
Okay.
but it's work that a well-educated reader looks at and goes, I don't have the faintest idea what this is doing.
That's in.
Oh, it's very in. It's very
So
in.
it's in to be over your head.
Yeah. And I've heard some of the authors in question say, well, if you don't understand my poetry, you're not working hard enough.
I've heard
Thank
that
you
too.
very much. I've got a PhD in English. If I don't understand it, I have
You
enough
aren't working
other,
hard
but there are a lot of wonderful poets.
Yeah.
Fortunately, a number of them have been poets laureate recently. I think Billy Collins is a terrific, interesting poet.
absolutely.
Rita Dove is a terrific, interesting poet. Kay Ryan. These are, the people who pick poets laureate are doing a good job of picking people who are technically superior, and they're also accessible. And that's what I look for.
So
I want a surface that I can get into and find something under that surface that's really interesting.
And it doesn't matter to you if it rhymes or not.
Although more often it doesn't.
More often it doesn't.
Because, frankly, rhyming is incredibly hard.
Does it have a moral?
If you can tell what the moral is without thinking about it, probably not the book for me.
Okay.
Because that's hitting you over the head.
Humor?
Trust the reader. Oh, often.
Often. Humor is a
Yes.
good way to get in.
Yes. I don't think there's anything here particularly, but there's a poet out in Chicago named Pamela Miller, whose first book with us is called Recipe for Disaster.
Yeah.
And
I've
she
heard
has a
of that.
poem called Recipe for Disaster, and it's hysterically funny. She's got a poem that's a resignation letter to the boss from hell. She's got recipes for the perfect man, and they
That's
are
funny.
very funny. And we just had another book of hers. I don't think I have it here. Yeah, humor,
All
absolutely.
right. So your key
I mean, that
advice.
poem I read is funny.
It's funny and it's creative and it has a lesson.
I guess.
Yeah, a
Yes.
story.
It has
There's
a story.
behind
Absolutely
it.
has a story.
Yep.
Much more than many of my poems
Yeah.
do. It has a story.
Okay, so key. If you're going to send a piece of work to you, make sure we read your guidelines to know
Yep.
what it is you accept
Yep.
and don't accept.
Now, linked to our submissions page, there is a page from another press that is addressed to people who have not published much. And one of the things they will tell you, which is true for me, is mostly I don't publish poets who haven't had a fairly good range of magazine publications. That doesn't necessarily mean the New Yorker and
Right.
Poetry magazine. They can be small, legitimate, small
Right.
places, people that have, it's just the first magazine they ever put out. And people who edit small presses are almost always writers. They're people who love writing.
Yep.
And they have the same temperament that I do, that they want to help someone else to get the
Yeah.
word out. And when you give a reading, that's when people buy books.
Right.
You give a reading, and they may buy 5 or 6, and they'll think that's
And
not
do
very
readings.
good. But actually, that's
I'm
not
out there
bad.
all the time.
5 or 6 is not bad
Yeah.
in a house of 20, and you're lucky to get 20 with a poetry reading.
Well, this is one guest that makes me say I hate the fact that we're a 28-minute show because I could talk to you for hours.
There's one thing I absolutely want to tell you about.
Please do.
And that is the Woodstock Mayapple Writers Retreat.
Okay.
That card over there, I don't know if the
Very
cameras can get
important.
it.
Woodstock Mayapple Writers Retreat. It's summer of 2013.
Well, but there will be one in 2014.
Okay.
It's over
so
for this year.
when do we start looking for it?
You can find it even now in the Writers' Conferences and Centers page on the Associated Writing Programs website.
Okay. And
You can
it's
find
in
it
Woodstock?
on our, no, that's a national organization.
Oh, okay.
You can find it on our website,
All right.
www.mayapplepress.com. It's
Okay.
once a year, it's a week. It is not a beginner's workshop.
All right.
It's generally for people who have a book from a
And
reputable
how long is
publisher.
it? Is it like
it's a week.
A whole week.
We do not have teachers because the people who are accepted for it, and it's very small, it's only 16 people.
Wow.
And that is because everyone gets a reading in a public setting.
And
I don't
right
wanna
now you have
more than
openings.
4 well, we haven't started recruiting for next year.
So get in there right away. You
Look
have
at
to be
the
serious
website.
about your work.
You have
though.
to be serious about your work. You have to have been published. I won't say we would never take a self-published book, but I bet it would be hard. Because
Okay.
most self-published books are not very good. Now, that's not a universal statement.
Nope. All right. I hear you because I encourage many of my writers to self-publish.
It's getting
They have
truer and
difficulty.
truer. It's really hard
Yep.
to get published, even by a press at my level,
Yep.
certainly by the big publishers that you've heard of. It's really, really hard.
And-
And the whole industry is in an uproar because of
Will
electronic
you take a
media.
book that's been self-published?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Now,
Okay.
let me say something about
All right.
novels. Someone came up to me and said, St. Martin's, I think it was, has accepted my novel. I self-published it. I sold 7,000 copies. And I said, bless you. Novels are a different thing. If you self-publish a novel and you do good sales, there may be a big
publisher will
house that's
pick it
going to
up.
want to pick it up,
All right.
but not poetry.
So if we call Mayapple Press, could we get to talk to you?
Yeah. I pick up
And
the
do you
phone.
go to this?
Oh, yeah. I do this
You
because
run
I
this
want
retreat.
this.
If you want to know more, you have to do that because we are out of time. Thank you for joining us. What a great guest. It was a pleasure having you. Stay tuned. We have more guests coming, but you need to go to May Apple Press. Find out more, get your poetry published. Thank you for joining us.